G'day everyone. Welcome to the EV Charging Podcast, where we take you behind the scenes of the electric vehicle charging industry in Australia and around the world. I'm Jeff Sykes.
And I'm Daniel Carson.
And we're your hosts from Solar Choice, Australia's largest independent quote comparison service, covering solar, batteries, EV chargers, heat pumps and aircon.
Today's interview is with Dave Watson, the founder of Ohme, a leading EV charging company in the UK and a relatively new but rapidly growing presence here in the Australian market too. Dave joined us all the way from Ireland and shared his experiences incubating Ohme as a little tech startup under the umbrella of his existing organisation, Temporis Capital. He shares some of the processes and strategic planning in figuring out which international markets were best suited to Ohme when he started expanding. And this episode is a great listen for any entrepreneurs, particularly those who are focused on energy and tech, to hear about Dave's learnings along the way, growing Ohme from a little idea to a company with a global presence today. And here's our interview with Dave. Might start off with a question that goes right back to childhood. You grew up in Ireland, where you're still based. Were the seeds of entrepreneurship and being a business person sort of planted from a very young age?
Well, I'm not sure I was an entrepreneur for a young age, but I think I do recall my dad always giving out to me saying that I had half-finished projects everywhere. So I'd get really passionate about something, really get into it for a few weeks or a few months, and then run on to the next thing that I'd be super passionate about and really dig in. And all of a sudden, that was the most exciting thing I was working on and stuff. I don't really recall that much besides my dad just giving out to me the whole time for that happening. And I think that's pretty much where I think if I map forward all these years, I think it's a bit like that as an adult entrepreneur. You get so enthusiastic about solving a problem, and because you're into it that much, you just, I guess, get over the initial hump and get it moving. And that kind of starts to ultimately to finish it and move it into an outcome or a business thing. You need people and an army behind you. So I guess the starting piece is the part of my personality that I can see is reflected most in where I am now.
Are there any projects or hobbies from way back that have sort of sent you in the direction that you've gone now?
Well, I used to be quite into planting trees and the environment. So it's kind of where I started. As a kid, I used to just collect seeds and plant little mini trees or mini oak trees. And then when I grew up, I planted them around the local GA pitch and things like that. So I was really into seeds to trees. I was also into wildlife. David Attenborough was somebody I was really passionate about. So the two of them really got me focused on I guess the environment and things like that, because I just liked everything to do with that. So I think about in 2008 when I reconnected to my supervisor, Sir David King from uni. He had subsequently after I'd done my PhD, he had gone and become chief scientific advisor to Tony Blair's government and set up the Climate Change Act, and I'd see him on TV talking about global warming and energy security and things like that. So when I reconnected him in 2008, I think that was when I decided, or 2008-9, I decided I want to start to focus on projects and businesses that had more positive impact. So I think that's where the kind of passions about the things I had as a kid linked to later, I guess, my later business and my later business, or the change in direction to start to try and found businesses that had impact.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I have to share that my story is pretty similar in that I started at the Commonwealth Bank, very sort of finance role, and that was a good fit for my sort of interests at the time. But so I took a couple of years off, and when I decided to go back, it was really for something with purpose, and that's how I got started at Solar Choice. And not saying it's necessarily the same, but that looks like a transition you went through in your earlier career and then transitioning into starting Temporis.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think it's nearly. Well, I wouldn't say it's nearly identical. Like you, I did go into finance, started investing stuff, and I guess I began to think about allocating capital and investing in things that had a good risk return. So I did meet, as I said, I met Sir David King, and he started talking about these renewables and renewable energy projects, and I kind of guess I looked at that and I could see that climate change was real, and there was a kind of inevitability about pumping so much carbon into the atmosphere that people would have to eventually figure out that they needed lower carbon energy. And so then as I started to, I said, well, I'd like to change business has changed purpose. And I thought at that early stage, I'll invent something. I was a scientist. Let's do something like that. And that's where Temporis Capital started. So we started to develop. What I mean, develop to the early stage, take the early stage risk with our own money to try and understand what these projects look like, what was all the risk. And once we did that, then we persuaded investors that actually we could safely manage their money and get them decent returns. So we started to raise money from sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, family offices, and then eventually what they call listed vehicles that owned these assets on behalf of retail investors. So we got pretty, that early days from say 2010 until 2016 were reasonably wild. Just even the fact that you were building and owning and operating a solar farm, a wind farm, a waste to energy project, or even a hydro scheme, that was all quite novel, and all the things we were learning to do were quite what being done for the first time, and we saw quite extraordinary drops in the prices of solar over those years. We saw solar dropping from a project, I mean, I just put it in nominal terms, 1 megawatt of solar in Spain in 2008 was 7 or 8 million euros to build. By the time we got to 2016, that was. But because we managed all these wind and solar projects, we started thinking about how can we manage that? How can we ensure that we create a more balanced proposition? So we started looking at batteries, huge containerized batteries as a way of managing the grid. And around the time I was told the story, South Australia was actually one of the first places that built the biggest one. Elon Musk had a massive one in South Australia because you had the most
Palmdale battery.
So that I started looking at that, and then there was all sorts of people in the UK wanted to try and build those same batteries. But at the time, again, I looked at the batteries, and I was like, well, God, they look like solar. The prices of batteries are dropping in the same way. So it seems a bit risky for me to start to install these big battery installations when the prices of batteries are going to be 20% cheaper next year and the year after. It's crazy. I started to think about it, and I persuaded myself that batteries were on the same curve as solar. Kind of put it into perspective. If you looked at a battery of a Tesla Model X in about the 90s, that was about £1 million. In the early 2000s, that was about $250,000. By the time I was looking at it in 2016, it was about $35,000. $30,000. It's now about $6,000. Yeah. So if you look at that cost curve from 1990, 1 million to whatever 2024, 5 where we are now, it's about $6,000. Instead of looking at batteries, thought a bit more laterally and thought, EVs. If batteries were that cheap, what would that mean for EVs? And I thought, well, if the battery's 6,000 and the drivetrain is 3 times more efficient than an internal combustion engine, maybe if we could utilize that battery when the EV is charged, then EVs will be the mass form of transport much quicker than people would think. I thought, well, why not try to set up a business to help utilize and manage those EVs? And I guess a lot of the people in my industry were in the solar industry were focusing on fast charging and destination charging, and thought, oh God, well, let's build some infrastructure. Where I thought, well, actually, we could build a business that could help people charge at the cheapest times when they were parked 95% of the time at work or home, and help people charge at cheapest times, and then effectively also help balance the grid and consume energy when there was an abundance, and maybe push it back in when there wasn't enough. So that was the idea. That was about 2017.
So set the scene for us, Dave. In 2017 in the UK, how many EVs were there on the road? What was the EV industry look like?
So let me just try and do a quick calc in the back of my head. 1%, 20,000. I'd say they were doing about 10,000 to 15,000 EVs a year in the context of 2.5 million sales. So maybe there was 40,000, 50,000 EVs on the road and about that time. And then it grew to 30,000 EVs, then in a year, 30,000 new ones, and then 50,000. Then it went about 80,000 additional ones as we went through from 2017, 18, 19. Till now, in the UK, they're doing probably about 400,000 full EVs a year. So we're but back in 2017, it was more around 10 to 20,000 a year. We only had 4 models, basically. We had a Tesla, we had a Renault Zoe, Nissan Leaf, and BMW i3 were the 4 most. It was only literally 4 types of EVs on the road at that stage.
And so how did the inception of the business take place? Did you receive some funding? Or obviously you would have been pretty focused on Temporis Capital up until that point.
So we were I guess we were already fortunate that we had a business. So we had a lot of the infrastructure in place that you need to run a business that wasn't just about the act of making hardware or selling it. So we incubated the business within the Temporis group. So we took people from Temporis that could do all the various different parts, which weren't really the technology aspects. So we brought on board a CTO and another couple of technology people to develop the hardware. So all the investment that we put in outside our own basic infrastructure was into developing the hardware and the software proposition within, I guess, the Temporis umbrella. So it was our own money and our own time and effort and sweat to get it going.
And so you mentioned that you were taking a slightly different angle to the incumbents, which is around the smart tariff integration. So give us an idea of what that is in simple terms.
Well, if I go back to the start, even before, there wasn't even any smart tariffs when we started. They didn't exist. So the first incarnation of this, we just thought, well, we could actually charge in the cheapest carbon times. And eventually, if we had enough of Ohmes out there, we could group them together to provide this big, I would say, virtual power plant. Yeah? Because we needed the energy suppliers to create some smart tariffs or time of use tariffs in order for the system to work. But they didn't, in 2016, they didn't exist. Because at that stage, the best you had was maybe a day-night tariff. But I mean by that was more expensive in the day and cheaper at the night. And most energy companies believed at that period of time that customers didn't actually care about their energy prices. The energy company, they just wanted a simple tariff and the energy companies would solve everything. So we didn't really have the ingredients in the first place. But we met Greg Jackson from Octopus when they were really small. I think maybe at 70, 80,000 customers. And he was the first energy supplier to believe that time of use or energy tariffs where you had windows of time where it was really cheap to charge were actually viable. And if you had a technology like ours, which made it really easy to move the load to or move your charging to the times when it was really cheap, then it could be really easy for a customer to change their to charge at those times. And what it really means is a customer plugs in their car, they tell us, they want to be 80% full at 8 a.m. Yeah. So we have an integration with the car and we say, well, how much is in the car? The 60% or 40% in the battery. They say they want to be 80% full. So we say, okay, the car needs 40%. They say they need to be full at 8 a.m. And that means, okay, that's 13 hours. They only need to charge 40% is only 3 hours charging. You're plugged in for 13 hours, which are the cheapest 3 hours to charge. So the algorithm just calculates the cheapest 3 hours and then charges in those hours. So that's at its very heart. That's what it is. It just is shifting your charging to the periods where energy is cheaper. So that was quite neat, and that did for a period of time give cheaper prices than go. And quite funnily enough, when this is one of the cool things, lockdown came in 2020, energy prices went negative. Now you've seen negative energy prices a lot in Oz now, but this was the first time they went negative in the UK, and customers were actually paid to charge. Lockdown came, demand dropped, a windy, sunny spring long weekend, prices went negative for the first time ever in the UK, and Octopus Energy Agile customers got paid to charge. And that was like the first time that had ever happened. Nobody had seen that. So that was I guess the next version of smart tariffs and more dynamic tariffs. And again, that was super exciting for all the early adopters and all the new people because they had never seen anything like that again.
Just lingering on that for a moment, Octopus Energy, I guess for the audience benefit, is one of the leading retailers in the UK, similar to an Origin or an AGL in Australia. And we do have some of these wholesale pass-through contracts in Australia, but most people are still on a peak-off-peak or peak-off-peak and shoulder tariff. So I think it's the people like EV owners who are more interested in these dynamic tariffs. Interesting piece of technology that you've built and angle that you're taking in terms of helping owners ultimately find the cheapest way to charge the car.
This was, I described, I guess, the direction or the progress in the UK, because once Octopus did this and set the scene for this, then other suppliers followed. Because actually, when the technology made it really easy for the customer to access cheaper energy, so as I said, all the customer had to do is plug in the car, set their settings in our app, link to the tariff, and then they could have the cheaper energy in it. They were saving 300 or 400 quid a year, or $600 to $800 versus a standard day-night tariff. There's a pretty big incentive for people to do it. And if people have a gas car, they'll drive around the corner to save a few cents on a liter of diesel. So why are they not going to press a few buttons on an app or move energy supplier to move loads?
Especially when you pair that opportunity for wholesale power prices, more tariff variation, and the prevalence of rooftop solar as EV uptake
100%.
increases. It's just such an obvious business case for the average person to see how much cheaper it will be to run than an ICE vehicle, or coming pretty soon, how they will be able to make money from having a smart charger and solar on their roof and run their vehicle.
100%. I agree completely. I mean, the conditions are even better in Oz than they are in the UK, because you do have an abundance of solar, which we clearly don't have in England, and I'm sure there's plenty of jokes about that. But
we've heard a few, yes.
But there is an abundance of solar energy, and now there is abundance on people's roofs, and there are periods of time when prices go really negative. So with the technology we have, which is now all we have, with some of the things that Octopus have done, and they're part owned by the Origin Group, or even OVO have done, who have now done a JV with AGL. They all have the technology you need at the supplier side to provide what the customers need on the supplier side, and the things you need on the hardware side. Us and other companies like us have that.
And so is that one of the reasons that attracted Ohme to the Australian market, is the abundance of solar, and perhaps that we're in a similar position to where the UK was 5 years ago?
Yeah, I think, look, a couple of things. Look, we focus very much on off-street parking, not of people with off-street parking. So why? Because, look, that's where most of the flexibility is. What do I mean by that? That where people have their own dedicated charger, they plug it in, it's plugged in for 13 hours a day. You can move the load around and have access to cheaper energy. There are other ones where people don't have off-street parking, that use fast chargers. So when we look at countries, one of the first things is, where's there a lot of off-street parking? And look, 80% of people have off-street parking. So that's one piece that's really, really great. You do have abundance of solar, which means energy price volatility. That's another amazing ingredient for us. You do have a number of energy companies that are forward-looking and dynamic. It's not just the two big ones. There's Amber Electric and a few more of other innovative energy companies. That's another ingredient you need, because if the energy companies are not innovative, there's nothing you do. And the last thing is EVs. So until last year, there was very, very few EVs in there. So it was very, very nascent. So it's quite difficult for a company over here, in the UK, to launch into something like that. But all of these things have come together to make Australia a really, really, really great place for Ohme to grow into it and bring the technology we've developed over here out to Oz, and then put a kind of an Australian spin on it.
So you've had a very strong partnership with Octopus Energy. Do you think they have similar plans to move out to Australia? We've seen, for example, OVO Energy, which are a UK company set up in Australia. Do you think that Octopus will follow suit, or will you look to set up a partnership with a local retailer here?
Look, we started very much with Octopus, and as you said, we have a strong partnership, but that's because I guess they moved earlier and they were one of the first guys to move. And so, but, we also worked and created partnerships with the other big retailers in the UK that wanted to do it. Because if you imagine, we've got big deals with the car companies like Volkswagen and Mercedes and Audi and all of those. And, when there's customers buy an EV, the last thing they want to do is decide what energy company they want to buy while they're buying and purchasing an EV. So if we're going to create a proposition for them, we want them to be able to say, well, we'll give you access to the cheapest energy you can with your own supplier, irrespective of what it is. And then if you want to then move to another supplier, we'll also facilitate that. It's very important, because we don't want to create barriers at that point of purchase. Yeah, a barrier would be you have to move energy supplier. Doesn't matter that one's better. They're like, I don't want to think about that. So we moved and changed how we did. So we had to move into a position where we would work with multiple energy suppliers in order to accelerate the adoption. So our partnerships changed. And so when we come to Oz, we will work, and we are working and begin to work with the more forward-looking ones that want to create these types of tariff and be happy to provide their customers the best outcomes that they offer. Yeah. So our approach into Oz is largely agnostic to what Octopus are going to do there, because there are plenty of Aussie retailers that are creating interesting tariffs and want to create interesting propositions for their customers, and that's the way we look at it.
I'm interested in the conditions that you mentioned that made Australia, or make Australia, a good proposition for expansion. Around the same time, in the last year or so, you've also expanded into other new markets as well. I'm assuming for the same reasons, and I'm interested in what those markets are and if they're at a similar stage in EV uptake to where Australia is.
Well, I mean, I think, look, each I mean, there's certain attributes of all the countries that are the same, but then each country has its own local aspects that the local conditions that make them more or less attractive in short periods of time. But ultimately, they will all get to the same place at a period of time, because they will all have more rooftop solar, more wind, more imbalance, and more EVs, because EVs will, the transition is accelerating. So for us, it's more, it's what's the opportunity now, and then what's the opportunity in the future. So we've expanded into France, different characteristics, less it from a price volatility, it's got a lot less because it's got a nuclear power plants. And so it looked like it had a steady price and steady thing. So the flexibility that we would offer would not be. Hardware on the conditions, it had a lot of, it's further along in its percentage EVs. It's got more EVs on the road. It's got some technology barriers that mean every EV charger can't come in. So if we fix those technology barriers, we get in. So once we've done those changes, it's actually quite, from a hardware perspective, quite attractive. But it didn't look like it had all this flexibility stuff. However, this is connected to the rest of Europe, and there's extreme price volatility in Belgium and Holland in particular because of energy policies in Holland. Holland have a net metering regulation, which means that you get to offset all the power you produce from your solar against your bid, against your normal production over the course of a year. So you don't have to match your solar in your house. If you're paying 35 cents or 40 cents for a kilowatt hour, as long as you produce it for solar, you can offset it at any time of the year. So that makes solar on your own rooftop really attractive. So the Dutch are covering their roofs full of solar, and now it's nearly every second day in the summer has negative power prices in Holland, but they're connected to France. So they're exporting price volatility to France, which is now making France more interesting. So the ingredients that you need for companies like for us, for the things that we like to do, they start to emerge in different countries for different reasons.
It's interesting. Some of our Australian listeners will be thinking about moving to Holland, having heard that, especially in the context of some states in Australia thinking about penalising people for feeding into the grid until we get to a point where the grid stability is not the issue that it is right now.
The feed-in tariffs in Australia, we had an even better incentive than Holland to begin with, where there was a premium feed-in tariff, so you could get paid 50, 60 cents for solar fed into the grid when you'd be buying power at 20, 30 cents. And then over the past 15 years, that has slowly crept down and down and down to the point now where the majority of contracts offer less than 5 cents per kilowatt hour for feed-in tariff. So a lot of people installed these enormous systems 5, 10 years ago that were far bigger than they needed for their home, and are stuck now producing energy that's really not worth anything until they can utilize it for a EV or something else. So that does drive a lot of volatility in the grid. We have a lot of negative price events, and that actually makes the concept that you've raised of smart tariff integration really interesting, because I bet in that moment that those EV owners in the UK that were using Ohme chargers got paid to charge their car, that was a really big news event. And I suspect it would be just the same here. There's a few electricity tariffs that offer free charging at certain times of day, but I'm yet to see something that will pay you to charge your vehicle. But as soon as it does, it's things like that really get people talking amongst their friends. They'll be front page of the news and can really drive interest in an uptake of electric vehicles ultimately.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it is, as I said, the regulatory environment does drive different structures quite in different countries. In Germany, you'll see people were effective, that there was no net metering. People installed there was lots of feed-in tariffs, and people installed lots of solar. But then prices increased massively on the prices of energy. So people were wasting that solar. So actually batteries started, home batteries. There was a massive incentive to put home batteries in. There was some grants, but also from an economics point of view, because you could capture that energy that you were wasting at 35, 40p or cents to put batteries. So Germany's got loads of batteries. Didn't historically have that many negative prices until the Dutch started exporting, and then they created these things. So what you see is regulatory conditions create opportunities for different business models. And for us, the one about capturing the value in your EV is all driven by price volatility. And as you said, Australia has now that because of, I guess, legacy solar that's gone on in the place. And now people have this energy that if it's not captured by EVs, is driving these negative events. And it's only a small step away to be able to actually start to create tariffs and things to be able to capture that and capture people's imagination And then, as you said, then you're away. Then people start to look at their EV quite differently.
So I got a question for you there, Dave, just to zoom in on something you said about Germany really focusing on driving the home battery evolution. One thing that, is inevitable, that vehicle to grid is on the way and that vehicles will be used as a battery for the home. And the reality is, if you look at the cost per kilowatt hour of a battery within a car versus a battery that you can attach to your solar system, the car's way cheaper. It's almost half the price, and it's also a car. So do you think there will be a future for the home battery market, or will the vehicle to home and vehicle to grid evolution of EV charging be a category killer for that?
Well, I think it depends on whether you think about it about you go AC V to G or DC V to G. And what do I mean by that? I think just kind of if your inverters, if you look at when you want to get for your listeners, if you want to get energy from the grid into your car, you have to have an inverter. So it turns it from AC that's in the grid into DC to charge your battery. So most of the original cars only had one-way inverters, so you could only invert the energy as you put it back, as you put it into the car, because those inverters were expensive or heavy, so the car manufacturers didn't want to put them in. So the first phase of V2G cars or V2G chargers, which is DC, was we'll make a new home charger where we'll have an inverter on the side of or in the charger. So when we want to take the energy from the car and put it back into the grid, we'll invert it on the charger on the wall and put it back into the grid. But that technology as a package is relatively, that charger is a lot more expensive than a normal AC charger. And what have we seen in Europe? This year, we've seen an emergence of cars with two-way inverters. They're starting to come into the pipe, and more of the car manufacturers are announcing plans for AC-enabled V2G cars. Now, for me, that's a fundamental game changer, because you have a car that's enabled that's V2G enabled. You now can drive it with a charger that's no more expensive than a normal charger. So now you can then really capture the value or the cheapness of those kilowatt hours in the battery, that you talked about, in the battery in your car, rather than the battery in your wall. So I don't think DC V2G can disrupt a home battery proposition. Why? Because that car needs to be plugged in for it to work. There's a cost barrier in the charger. So home batteries are going to be a better proposition. When you have AC V2G enabled, then that can potentially not be a game changer or a deal killer, because there are people with higher energy users and might trade it, would still put in some whole batteries. But for a large swathe of the operation, for the population, the AC piece is the part that will actually change stuff. So if you can imagine, then you imagine a future, and this is what I said to people. Imagine a future. You've got a piece. We know that the Chinese can make an EV for about $10,000. Just as an example. I'm not saying they sell it for that, but they can make it for about $10,000. You then put in a normal home charger at the cost of oil, which is whatever, $1,500, $2,000 is the cost of that. And then they can charge the car at $100. But they can plug in the car every day and effectively load shift, take all their peak demand in their house, use your car to use your peak demand, and then shift that to off peak and effectively save another $600 or $700 or $800 a year on their home bill. Forgetting about trading and all this V2G and all this stuff. Imagine, so you get your EV, you use your home charger, and you save $600 or $700 a year for a piece of metal that costs $10,000 to make. What's the residual value of that in 5 years? You can still drive with it. You can save all this money on that piece of kit. So that's, to me, is the future, where actually the car and your own connection point at home is the thing that has massive value. So to me, that doesn't mean that there isn't a space for home batteries. It's just that is in itself a proposition that will work for a lot of people.
Just to change pace for a second, the EV charger market is one that's grown more and more competitive in the last 4 or 5 years, especially. It seems that almost every man and his dog's bringing out a new EV charger now, to a point where it's looking like a very commoditized market. You've obviously expanded into a number of different overseas markets, and it sounds like you're focusing on off-street.
Yeah, so when charging is done, or largely done, so when all the charger has to do is charge or not charge, it's just a piece of hardware that can be relatively easily commoditized. It doesn't even matter if there's higher technical specifications that locally mean it needs to be X, Y, Z for a grid. That's quite an easy problem to solve. However, as you start to move to smart charging world where you want to turn on and off the charger reliably, which isn't an easy problem to solve for a number of reasons and to do with the car, and you want to integrate to the most dynamic tariffs to allow people to have cheaper energy, that's more difficult to solve. So that doesn't just, and to do that reliably is a different problem. And it doesn't matter that your charger might work 90% of the time or 80% of the time. For when the time it doesn't work and it doesn't charge, or there's issues or you don't have access to the cheaper energy, they cause massive pain points for customers. So when you look at, I'm going to save $50 or $100 up on the install, what good is that if you can't access $400 worth of saving or $500 worth of saving every year? And when there's a problem, there's nobody there to deal with it, or they don't have the economies of scale, or they're not reliably fix it. So there's a kind of a service threshold that is increased in much more of the in the markets, and the customer expectation goes up and what they want and what they expect. And when those customers are part of a larger fleet, or they're connected to somebody else who's effectively selling another service to them, which may be a car manufacturer selling the car, a leasing company leasing the vehicle, an energy company wanting to provide them a smart tariff as part of their proposition, that overall customer experience and how that sits together becomes super important. And it's not what it's like for the average person, it's what it's like for the worst 20% of outcomes and people. And that is the same customer service, customers thing that causes most companies to fail in every project. So what you find is that people get smarter and their expectations increase, and people who want to, and big B2B clients who want more of a participation in this newer world, as their requirements increase, the world actually competition decreases, because it's not just a piece of plastic or a box on the wall. It's actually a service proposition. So we focus very much on that part and the overall service around reliability, customer service, and cheaper energy. I mean, there is massive pain points in the install piece as well. So that's not even, I was just talking about the in life. In the install piece, how do you going to get the price that people say they were, whether you get it installed on the day, if you're selling a car and you buy a car, how do you know that the person is going to get a good deal on it? And, you can pay money you go to your local dealership, you pay money for a new car, and the installation journey is a nightmare. It's $1,000 more than they said it was. All these things are problems that need to be solved as part of the transition. So what we do very much is we focus on all the services and all the problems that go around the box, and then I guess the box that comes later. So that's how we as an organization just think of the bigger picture. And we are launching, and we will launch reasonably soon, our managed journeys in Australia for individuals as well as B2B partners. So we can drive quality in that part of the customer experience, or dependability or accountability.
Dave, something we like to ask all of our guests is looking beyond the next 5 or 10 years, not necessarily for Ohme as a company, but to the industry as a whole. What do you think is on the distant horizon for e-mobility, 10, 15, 20 years away?
That's a long time. I mean, I think it's going to change so profoundly in 5 to 10 years that, you have a number of competing factors. You've got your own personalized home energy management. Yes. So it'll be relatively easy to create your own home energy expert in your own house. And you'll have your own ingredients, which are your solar panels, maybe your heat pumps, your car, and they're all going to work in sync with your energy supplier and stuff to do that. And in 5 years, you'll have to think about it very little, because you'll have your expert in your pocket. That's on the one part. And then on the car side and the driving side, you've got clearly cheaper vehicles. That asset is worth a lot. Sorry, your asset being your grid connection point in your car is actually worth quite a bit. And if that piece of metal is cheaper, you've got something that you can drive for cheap and for free. But then you also have a form, intelligence emerging in the form of autonomous vehicles or parts of autonomous driving. So in another form of intelligence. So you have big, massive trends that are going to, I guess, completely change how we consume, how we consume energy, how we move around, and how we manage that. But I think it'll be messy in the next 5 to, let's say 4 to 6 or 7 years, as we have multiple technologies, multiple use cases, multiple suppliers, and all this technology is changing quite quickly. But out beyond that period, it gets the whole thing, they integrated and making it much easier for consumers, and they have to think about it very little, but they get to benefit from all of these things. I think that's where it'll ultimately go to, and a lot quicker than people. Yeah.
It's probably fair to say that a lot of what's on the distant horizon, and particularly the general public who doesn't think much about this space, probably can't even fathom the rate of change in the industry is such that 20 years, you need a crystal ball to really look that far ahead.
Well, I think my belief in 10 years, it'll be unrecognizable for 30 to 40% of the drivers. You'll still have the people that have the long tail of ICE vehicles that are still out there that won't want to change because they still have the barrier of maybe a cost up front. There might be better funded models that the overall cost of EVs will be cheap. And then in parallel, there'll be lots of other, there'll be more autonomous driving models where people won't even need to own their own car. They don't have that. And so that will work too. So that will compete with different models. So I think within 10 years, the whole energy and transport will be fully connected as things happen. They're only in the process of connecting now. In real terms, we will be fully connected. And as I said, the whole driving, the world of how people drive and how they think about how they pay for their vehicles and that energy thing will have changed for about 30 or 40% of the people. So I think most people don't see that now, and they don't think it won't change that quickly. Once the technology Rubicon changes both in price and capability, the transition won't be that. It will be quite quick.
It certainly feels like an exciting spot to be in, potentially at the tip of an iceberg, and an iceberg that could rotate in any different way with things like AI that could throw a whole spanner in the works and take the whole industry in a different direction. So very nice to be commentating on the sidelines through this podcast.
Completely agree.
It looks like that's all we've got time for today. So we want to really extend our thanks, Dave, for joining us and giving us that insight into the journey and what might be in the future for Ohme. We'll certainly be watching the team in Australia as they work to grab market share in what is still a relatively new market for the company, but I'm sure will be a pretty exciting space over the coming years.
Thanks for having me, and I really enjoyed our chat.
Thanks so much, David.
Thanks.
So that's it, and thanks for listening to this episode of the EV Charging Podcast. Brought to you, as always, by Solar Choice, Australia's only instant quote comparison service for solar, EV chargers, heat pumps, batteries, and air conditioning systems. We also provide independent consultation and tender management for clean energy projects in commercial and strata buildings with over 17 years of experience. Find out more at solarchoice.net.au and stay tuned for the next episode in 2 weeks.
If you think this is the best podcast you've ever heard in your life, maybe someone else will too. Make sure you share an episode and leave us a review on your favourite podcast app. See you in 2 weeks.